Welcome. My name is Bob Adams with Housing Virginia. This is the fourth part in a series on Housing 2020, what is shaping the future of housing in Virginia. This project by Housing Virginia looks at major trends that are happening in our state and nationally that are going to dramatically change housing over the next decade. If you are watching these four parts out of order, I'm going to go through the first 5 slides, which will give you a framework for the whole project. If you've already seen those, please skip forward to the part that begins the section that you haven't seen. So we have been through a very dramatic and traumatic period of time in housing in the country, in the state, and in many of our communities around Virginia. So just to give you a sense of that, one of the major studies that is done every year on housing in America is the State of the Nation's Housing, done by the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Here's a quote from the Center's report in 2009 at the depth of the housing recession depression. And you can see some pretty dire language here. Financial institutions taking massive write-downs, severe losses of both housing and stock wealth, consumer confidence plunging 41%, and households slashing their spending. So in 2009, 5 years ago, we were really in very bad shape in terms of housing. And that really has defined how we have looked at housing for the last 5 years, and to some extent how we're looking at it right now. In Virginia, we've had over 100,000 households lose their homes to foreclosure. We had the construction of new housing come to nearly a complete halt. Sales of existing homes in Virginia dropped to record lows. Even at this point, almost a quarter of all houses in Virginia are still underwater, meaning the homeowners owe more on their mortgages than their house is currently valued at. And finally, in Virginia and in the nation, we've seen homeownership rates begin to decline for the first time those have ever been tracked. So very, very significant changes happening in Virginia and in the nation as it relates to housing over the last 5 years. Now, where are we today? Here's a quote from the State of the Nation's Housing in 2012. And as you can see, very different outlook. 2012 marks the beginning of a true housing recovery. So the question is, are we out of the woods? Are we headed back to normal here? Well, not so fast. Here's Robert Shiller, who's a national expert in housing, quoted in the New York Times late January of this year. And basically, he's putting out a very big note of caution here. As you can see, he's saying, the unfortunate truth is that the tea leaves don't clearly suggest any particular path for housing prices right now, either up or down. So we're in a period, in a very important period coming out of the deepest housing recession we've had in 50 years. And for that reason, we think it's important to look at these broader trends. We don't want to focus on what's going to happen tomorrow or what's going to happen next week or even next month. We want to look at broad trends that are shaping housing over this next decade. And there are very sweeping trends that are going to be making big changes in how housing is built, financed, and where it's built over the next decade. It's going to dramatically affect our housing markets in Virginia and the housing products that we provide. And understanding these trends and the impacts is going to help us and our communities prepare to take advantage of these. And that's really the purpose of of Housing 2020. We want to do some big picture thinking here, not get down into the weeds, but really look at these big trends and what they will mean for housing in our state over the next decade. And we do that in 4 areas. The first is demographics, the second is economics, the third is finance, and the last one is green and sustainability. And that is what we're going to talk about right now, is the fourth of those, green, and how green trends are really reshaping what our housing in Virginia is going to be. And there's a bunch of topics that we're going to touch on here. There are changing consumer preferences related to green. Green homes and green communities have really become mainstream over the last 5 years, and that trend is going to continue. This has implications for how we look at housing affordability. Also, the importance of communities and homes being walkable and transportation oriented. That's a key factor in consumer preferences that we're seeing becoming more and more important. Technological advances are contributing to a different way that our houses will actually work, so-called smart houses that will begin to do things for us that we've had to do ourselves. And finally, there's been a real explosion in certification programs for green construction, for green housing. These third-party programs there are many of them now, and we want to talk a little bit about what those are and what the future for those are. So if you've listened to any of the earlier sections of Housing 2020, you know that we have an issue expert that we have worked with to put these sections together. For the green and sustainability section, Sandra Leibowitz is our issue expert. Sandra is the owner and the managing principal and the founder of Sustainable Design Consulting, which is a firm here in Richmond, Virginia, that operates throughout the country. Sandra provides expert advice on green design, both for commercial buildings and for residential buildings. She's a well-recognized expert who's been involved in this field for over 20 years. So, why is it that green and sustainability have become so important in residential development? Well, this is a very useful way to understand that. This chart shows you what the carbon footprint is of various kinds of activities that all of us are engaged in. And the size of the circle obviously represents the carbon footprint of the activity. Well, the largest one up there is airline passenger travel. So the worst thing you can do for the environment is to be constantly flying back and forth on long distance airlines. But the second largest circle up here is housing. So housing is has a major impact on carbon emissions, has a very significant impact environmentally, and that's why over the last decade we've really begun to look at housing as something that it's very important for us to find strategies to make housing more green, more sustainable, and reduce its carbon footprint on the environment. So let's hear from Sandra on when she looks forward, what our homes are going to be like 10 years from now.
I think we're going to see a bigger emphasis on urban living, but not the urban living of the past, sort of the urban living of the future with increased amenities, increased proximity to mass transit, and also an increased emphasis on quality. People are going to make more efficient use of their homes, and so they're not going to need quite as much space as they used to need. Some of that's going to involve things like an increased amount of single occupant households, and some of that's also going to involve the simple reality that we have so much less need for paper. If you're like me, a lot of my home is taken up by paper files from previous years of my life. I don't need as much space anymore to store that paper material in books because everything's digital now. With the increased tendency and movement towards sustainable urban living, people are going to have everything they need and then some in the housing of the future. They're going to have more access to a variety of transportation alternatives. They're going to have more access to amenities and shared community facilities.
So in the end, though, what we all want in housing is for it to improve our quality of life.
I think when you tie it all together, the picture that I have of housing in the future has kind of all of your quality of life needs met, or at least most of them, in a way that really uses less resources, so people can spend more time enjoying their lives, where their homes and their commutes and their transportation options don't get in the way of them enjoying their lives.
So one of the things that has happened very quickly in the last several years is that green has become mainstream in residential development and residential construction, and in the way we are thinking about remaking our communities. So you can see on this slide, 45% of architecture and engineering and construction firms expect to have green jobs by 2014. By next year, 45% of all firms involved in development are looking to have green be a part of what they do. And the projections are that by 2015, 2 years from now, the green building market share will be almost 50% of all construction done in the U.S. So it's no longer a trend, it's a major mainstream part of how we're doing business in residential building and development in Virginia and in the U.S. So here's an example of that, and this happens to be a short clip from a business journal in Nashville, but you see this kind of thing in many housing and development and real estate development magazines all over the country. This one happens to say, "Bye-bye McMansions, hello modest, energy-efficient homes in walkable communities." So this particular builder is talking about building smaller homes without extra bedrooms, without bonus rooms, that people don't use very frequently, but have to heat and have to pay for initially. So he's making spaces more functional and giving buyers the highest green certification that he can. I think this phenomenon of owning homes with spaces that are not used very frequently is something of the past. We're going to get much better and much more efficient at designing homes that are more functional, and as we're going to see in a few minutes, that's what the buyers of the future are going to be demanding. So it's not just about the housing, but it's about the communities in which they are located, and those are urban communities, or what we would say village communities. So it doesn't necessarily mean a central city of an older urban area. It could be a village type development in a suburban community.
People are really getting tired of those kinds of more far out suburban neighborhoods where they feel more separated from their neighbors. I think it's natural to want to know your neighbors to some extent, and so I think that more community-oriented housing in the future will have more attractive, safe, and convenient spaces for residents to just naturally interact. I think we're going to see an increase in the sort of more low to mid-rise urban living. Mid-rise urban living in particular is something that's both attractive and human scale while still offering all of the amenities and convenience and affordability of urban living. I think what we're going to see for those communities that are more urban is just an increased number of options for how to get around. That could include presence of Zip cars or Flex cars, which are two companies that offer shared car services, similar to a rental, but not exactly like a rental. Some communities even have shared bicycles. For those residents who own bicycles, I think it's going to be more and more important that they have a safe, convenient, and ideally also attractive location to store those bicycles so they're not dragging them up 3 flights of stairs to their dwelling unit.
So urban or village living, transportation-focused living, walkable communities really are a key here. And these are not, when you actually look at historical trends, these trends started a while ago. So here you can see this is residential units, the percentage of residential units by central city, suburban, or outside metro areas. So suburban, you can see that really in the early 80s, the percentage of homes being built in suburban areas peaked, began to decline slightly, and then by early 2000s began a steep decline. At the same time, central cities, which had been in decline up until the early 90s, began to rise very rapidly. So we're seeing a lot more housing happening in central cities, outside of metro areas. Again, that trend is in decline right now. So one of the other aspects of green and sustainability and how it will affect housing has to do with the materials that are used. More energy efficient materials and more energy efficient design has increasingly become the rule in home construction.
I think that energy efficiency is one of the key issues that's going to be characteristic of housing over the next 10 years. Codes have been updated throughout the country, and they're still going to go through further updates over time to continue to require more energy efficient systems, better air sealing, more energy efficient windows and roofs and insulation materials. All of those things are characteristic of, again, quality construction, so I think that's going to be one of the most important transitions. I think also healthy and low-emitting building materials are going to become almost so commonplace that there won't be other options available. I think that that's a real basic expectation that people are beginning to have when they're renting or purchasing a home. And I think there are going to be some interesting advances in sort of smart home technology interrelating with people's ability to control systems remotely or while at home. And I think some of the interesting things in construction are going to include manufactured housing. I think that that has a lot of potential. It's already well in use currently, but I think has some more widespread potential ahead of it to really control the construction process and minimize waste by doing off-site construction.
And so it's not just a matter of materials and design that is more energy efficient, but sustainability has a lot to do with quality and durability as well.
I think one of the main things we're going to see in terms of improvements in quality of materials is that finished materials are not going to be the cheapest possible ones that the builder could have selected. They're going to be more durable materials in terms of flooring. Many people like wood flooring and seek out wood flooring. Solid surface countertops, maybe instead of laminated countertops. But it's also going to impact things like the windows, the quality of windows so that they don't warp and that they don't leak over time, as well as exterior materials such as siding and roofing materials. the asphalt shingles that are common on so much of our housing stock in this country is not something, for example, that you would see in Europe. In fact, I don't believe it's actually allowed by local codes to use that type of material throughout Europe. I think an example of roofing material that would be longer lasting for homes in this country would be metal roofing, whether it would be shingles or what they call standing seam metal roofing.
So we're already starting to see a lot of those kinds of changes that Sandra was talking about in terms of more durable materials being used both inside the home and on the exterior of the home. And how does this relate to affordable housing? And that's an important aspect of this, because there has been a perception that exists that green and sustainable development, because of some higher costs at the capital costs at the beginning, cannot be and should not be used for affordable housing.
You know, I think there's still a mindset out there that the best thing to do for affordable housing is to build it as inexpensively as possible, and I think that's just a general mindset shift that needs to take place. I do believe that the message of quality construction and that sustainable building really is quality building is one that's going to get heard louder and louder over time and really become part of the reason that it becomes almost required universally.
And so obviously one of the important aspects of that as it relates to affordable housing is that maintaining and expanding community support for affordable housing really requires that we build housing with good quality and good design. Here's an example in Richmond. This is market rate housing, but an infill project that was done that's a combination of a rehabilitation of an historic preservation of an existing building and infill new construction. Example of really good use of existing resources and really good new design. So very green and sustainable product, and one that was accepted by this community. We need to provide that same kind of care and quality when we're doing affordable housing. So I mentioned a minute ago this important issue of the additional costs that are incurred with some kinds of green and sustainable construction materials and techniques at the front end, and how is that balanced by savings?
I think there's really good news in terms of what's going to make housing more affordable over time, because really the biggest costs people are going to see are the increased costs for their utilities. That includes electricity, that includes gas, sometimes oil, but also we're going to inevitably see increases in the cost of water. And a green home, a sustainable home, inherently saves all of those. It conserves energy costs and it also conserves water costs. And so those things are going to be lower bills that low-income and moderate-income families are going to have to worry about. You're going to see savings in energy and water bills that really more than make up for any additional first costs in quality materials and high-performance systems and construction.
So that's really an important and a key point here is we need to begin to understand that there's a trade-off here where it may be slightly more expensive to produce good quality and high energy efficiency at the front end, but that is directly related to operating cost savings over time, both cost of utility cost savings and maintenance cost savings. And that's why low and moderate income households should also care about green housing.
Well, the first thing is that energy efficiency and water efficiency, both of those save on utility bills, and that's actually an extremely important consideration for any lower or mid-income family. That's the main way in which green building pays for itself over time. Another thing is that the quality and the comfort in a sustainable home, both are simply better because of the quality of construction, the better indoor air, the healthier materials to live by, and also it's just going to be more durable and require less maintenance.
So another very visible and important development that's been happening has to do with the size of the homes that we live in and the size of new homes that are being built. Back when we first started looking at home size of homes being constructed in the U.S. back in the 1950s, we've got a pretty clear trend that has emerged, which is that with a few ups and downs here and there, home sizes in the U.S. have continued to grow larger and larger and larger decade after decade. We now have seen what we think is perhaps a long-term change in that trend, and you can look at this chart, which goes from 1970 up through 2010, and you see at the when we were at the peak, or rather the depths of the housing recession in 2008, 2009, housing, the size of new homes being built in the U.S. leveled off and now has begun to decline. We think that's a trend that is likely to continue as home buyers are becoming more interested in smaller, better designed houses, houses that are going to be more energy efficient, be cheaper to operate in terms of utility costs and maintenance. So we think that going forward, probably less of this kind of house being built, these the McMansions that we saw rise to dominance in the last 20 years, and more of this small village, urban, cottage style housing that is more carefully designed, probably takes advantage of multi-purposing space within the house and utilizing exterior space as well.
I think one of the things we're going to see is a bit of a reversal of the trend over the last several decades for homes to just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And part of that has to do with the shift of focus of construction and new development from outer suburbs towards life in the city. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we're going to see some of the homes getting a little bit smaller, and just in general there being more options of home sizes that really address singles, that address empty nesters and people who really don't need and don't want to maintain a lot of space. One example of smaller housing that's pretty interesting, that's starting to pop up here and there across the country, is the concept of cottages and of pocket neighborhoods. And those really create small buildings that are suitable for just one or two people, but in an orientation that supports kind of a community feel. So they might be, a pocket neighborhood might have several homes that are smaller, that are oriented around a shared green space, for example. Another trend that I think we're going to see more and more of is this wonderful trend of adaptive reuse of older buildings, in many cases historic buildings that might combine even affordable housing tax credits with historic preservation tax credits. There are many wonderful industrial buildings with high ceilings that are perfectly suited to becoming loft spaces, which we're seeing more and more of in our older cities. And one of the reasons that urban living can be so much more sustainable is the tendency towards mixed-use developments where you can eat, live, and shop all within the same area, even work in the same neighborhood. There are several people in my company who actually walk to work, and they really enjoy the quality of life advantages of that.
So there are a lot of reasons why this trend towards smaller homes we think is likely to continue. Affordability is going to be increasingly important in an age of frugality, and there is a tendency to frugality coming out of the recession, which we are just now emerging from. We also know that energy costs, although they will fluctuate over time, in the long run, energy costs are going to continue to rise. So smaller homes are more energy efficient, are going to have lower utility bills. There are some demographic things going on that are going to contribute to this as well. If you've looked at one of the earlier sections to Housing 2020, it dealt with demographics, and you learned a lot about how aging baby boomers are going to affect the housing market. And of course, one of the things that happens with any retiring generation is that there is a tendency to downsize housing. The boomers are a very, very large, our largest component of our population, and so that downsizing is going to have an impact on housing demand. The large echo baby boomer, the millennials, now will become the driving force in new housing development over the next decade or 2 decades. And what we know about millennials right now is that they are not looking for a big house in the suburbs with a big yard. So that's going to contribute to this trend of smaller, better designed houses. In addition, we're in a period of significant uncertainty in housing finance, another one of the components of our Housing 2020 program. And one of the things you learn there is that credit's gotten tighter. And this is especially true for large mortgages, so-called jumbo mortgages, that used to be very commonplace in the last decade. Much stricter rules now around those large mortgages. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, small home buyers don't have to sacrifice the way that they used to, because we're doing a lot better job of home design and of multi-purposing spaces within homes. And then, of course, the age wave and how that affects green design in a couple of ways. One is that baby boomers are interested, some of them, in aging in place, staying where they are, getting maybe downsizing within their own house and creating a rental unit within the house as well. And then also you can see down here an example of so-called granny flat or echo cottages, which are small, very small houses that can be dropped in and put on a lot. So for example, an aging parent could still live independently but be very close to their children.
I think one of the ways that communities are going to serve their residents better over time is to allow people to age in place, which means to really be able to live in their homes throughout their lives or in the latter stages of their lives without having to necessarily downsize and necessarily move into an apartment building if they're used to living in a house. And I think architects do know how to design spaces that are what we call universally designed, so that people can add the grab bars in the showers later. There have been guidebooks for those kinds of design elements for many years, and many of those kinds of features are required in most types of multifamily construction. So I think it's more a matter of educating people on how they can stay in place and increasing the number of options for housing where they can stay in place.
So just last point I want to touch on is certifications. And one of the things that's happened over the last decade is we have had a lot of programs created to allow for third-party organizations to make sure and to certify that the construction is being done in ways that are appropriate, where the customer or the consumer is going to be able to realize the kind of energy efficiencies and comfort in the home as advertised. So right now, and you see a couple of signs up on the screen, Earthcraft House Virginia is one program that is very popular in Virginia that deals primarily with residential construction, both rental housing and owner-occupied housing. But there's also LEED for Homes. NAHB has a green certification program. Energy Star, we've all heard about Energy Star improvements in appliances. So some of this can be a little overwhelming and confusing for consumers.
What I see is that there are going to be some programs that start to consolidate and start to interrelate with each other. I think the main thing we're going to see is that more and more both professionals and consumers are going to become educated on the value of those systems, how to use those systems, and therefore we're going to see an increase in the number of certifications over time. One of the realities is there are so many different standards right now, especially in the residential market, that even the professional community is a little bit confused. So we're going to see some of those standards possibly fall away just because they're not getting the market use that others are. I think we're also going to see some standards that combine together and become more uniform with each other. I think the main thing we're going to see in that regard is that it's going to be more commonplace. You're going to have more of the requirements that are built into some of those standards become adopted by local codes, become very integrated into the builder market.
So final thing we'll hear from Sandra is just in looking at policy going forward, public policy as it relates to green and sustainability, what are the three most important areas that she sees?
If it were up to me to dictate public policy across the country today, I would pick three things that would be at the top of my list for how to make housing more sustainable, and those would be really continuing to increase the requirements for not just energy but water efficiency in homes, requiring alternative transportation options that really make it safe, convenient, and accessible for people to use a variety of options to get around. And then just to require as standard practice throughout the country healthy building materials so that people's home environments can be healthy places that sustain them.
So let me touch on what the main takeaways are from this discussion of how this green and sustainable the trend toward green and sustainability, what it really means for housing in the next decade. And so first of all, we've seen a growing preference among consumers for green in housing design and construction materials and performance, and we think that preference is going to continue to grow and be have an increasing impact on the market. Secondly, green housing is more affordable, but that needs to be understood in the context of the long run. Green housing may be slightly more expensive to begin, but in the long run, in terms of energy costs, utility costs, maintenance, it makes sense for all consumers, and especially low and moderate income consumers. Another point is that we really need to think in terms not just of green homes, but green communities. And that really ties into this idea that consumers are looking to have homes in urban areas, in suburban village type areas that are walkable and that are transportation focused. You heard Sandra talk about folks on her staff who can walk to work. or live in communities where they can both live, work, and play. And that is certainly the choice for both millennials who are coming into the market now, and also for boomers who are retiring and looking to change their living pattern. We talked a lot about the fact that housing is becoming smaller. So there'll be less space, but it will be more functional space, and it will be much more efficiently designed. Construction materials and construction advances are really racing forward, and in many cases they are outpacing codes, and codes are racing to keep up with changes in technology. The technology of smart homes is also moving forward very rapidly, with people being able to manage their homes from a distance through their smartphone. That technology is so far ahead right now that it has outpaced the ability of most consumers to utilize it. But consumers will, as they become more educated, will catch up with that. And finally, we're going to see some consolidation in third-party green certification programs, but even more importantly, we're going to see consumers become much more educated about the value and importance of green in construction. So thank you very much for tuning in to this section of Housing 2020. If you haven't seen the other 3 sections on demographics and economics and finance, those are also posted up on our website at www.housingvirginia.org. And while you're there, please take a look at some of the other resources that Housing Virginia offers. We have Sourcebook, which is the most comprehensive set of data on housing affordability in the state. It's very up-to-date and current. You can look in Sourcebook and find out information about what's going on with affordability in your community. We've recently added Playbook, which is a compendium of affordable housing programs throughout the state. You can research by type of program, and you can research by locality. If you're interested in encouraging and advocating for greater housing affordability in your community, Playbook is a good place where you can go and not have to reinvent the wheel. Find out what other communities are doing and how that's working. And then finally, we've just added a section on housing research so that you can go in and easily search through a lot of different research reports that have been posted both at the national level, at Virginia, for the state of Virginia, and for other states around the country, and find out what kind of research has been done that bears on the issue of housing affordability and the importance of affordable housing as a part of healthy communities. So thank you very much, and appreciate your tuning into this, this final part of Housing 2020.